Hello everyone, this is Dane and I'm going to introduce you today to the universe of Canadian film. I know, this statement is rather oxymoronic. How can there be a universe that belongs to a single country's film industry? However, by the end of this video, you'll start to see that the idea of a sovereign state's national cinema often extends and pushes past the idea of physical geographical boundaries. I want you to play a game. There is no prize for winning it, but maybe you can test this on others afterwards, whether you get it right or wrong, and can get a sense of satisfaction that way. Which one of these films is Canadian?
I ain't afraid to die anymore. I've done it already. It's called Inception. Already. I think I found a way home. And this last job, that's how I get there.
Did you guess The Revenant? The film was shot in Alberta's Kananaskis country, showcasing Canada's Rocky Mountains, and notably led the film's star Leonardo DiCaprio to become more involved with environmental groups, such as the Indigenous Climate Action, with the aim to try to start a difficult conversation around the province's main industry and economic focus being the oil sands. If you guessed this film, I'm afraid you're incorrect. Alright, did you happen to select Inception? If so, there is some reason to mistake the film as potentially being Canadian. Scenes were shot on the snowy slopes of Kananaskis once again, in Alberta, on Fortress Mountain to be exact. Unfortunately, the film is considered to be a co-production between the United States and United Kingdom. So, that would be an incorrect guess as well. This does make more sense logically though, right? The Revenant is simply an American film, although it is directed by Mexican filmmaker Alejandro Inarritu, produced by a combination of individuals such as Arnon Milchan of Israel and Steve Golan, Marie Perron, Keith Redmond, and James W. Scotchdoppel of the United States, as well as Inarritu himself. The film stars a quintessential Hollywood actor in DiCaprio, but also Native American actor Forrest Goodluck and Indigenous Canadian Dwayne Howard, and also prominently features the English Tom Hardy, Irish Domhnall Gleeson, and English Will Poulter. In the case of Inception, Christopher Nolan, the director, is British-American. The producer, Emma Thomas, is British, who also happens to be the wife of the co-producer, Christopher Nolan. And the film stars the American Leonardo DiCaprio once again, the Japanese actor Ken Watanabe, American Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Marion Cotillard of France, Canada's own Elliot Page, and English actors Tom Hardy, Michael Caine, and Cillian Murphy of Ireland. Now, if you so happen to have selected the film War Witch, entitled Rebelle in French, by Kim Nguyen, you have reason to feel pleased with your guessing ability, or rather your pre-existing expertise in Canadian cinema, or your ability to determine what constitutes a country's national cinema. The film was entirely shot outside of Canada, yes, not a single scene took place in the country, but the film is considered to be a Canadian artistic export to the rest of the world. Where was the film shot and produced? It was mostly filmed in the nation of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Central Africa, and stars Rachel Mwanza, who is a native of the Congo, as well as Serge Kanyinda, who is also Congolese. War Witch or Rebelle was directed by Kim Nguyen, a Canadian director who was born and raised in Montreal, Quebec, by a French-Canadian mother and a Vietnamese father. The film is also entirely in French and Lingala, two of the Congo's official languages. So we know the film was directed by a Canadian, but who produced it? It was produced by Pierre Yvan and Marie-Claude Poulin of Quebec, as well as Kim Nguyen. You might now see the big giveaway with determining a film's national origin, and it simply has nothing to do with where the film is physically shot, or the nationalities of the actors on screen, and sometimes not even where the director is from. As you might have guessed, it comes down to where the money is coming from. Typically, this will correlate with the producer's country of origin, or it comes from a film board of a specific nation or governmental grant, which also sometimes comes from specific governmental regions within a greater country, such as a province, state, territory, etc. Okay, now that you're a professional in spotting Canadian films from non-Canadian films, let's do one more test, shall we?
What are you afraid of?
I'm afraid of wondering if I'll miss it.
See you
Sometime.
soon.
I guess.
Were you thinking it must be Brokeback Mountain? Those gorgeous shots of the Canadian Rockies would be a definite point of deception, but like The Revenant and Inception, the film is only shot in Canada, but its funding cannot be traced to Canadian producers. Instead, it was produced by Americans in Larry McMurtry and Diana Osana, and directed by Taiwanese Ang Lee. And for the majority of the film, it stars the Australian Heath Ledger and American Jake Gyllenhaal. Now, if you guessed either Lawrence Anyways or Take This Waltz, you would be absolutely on the money. Both of these films are Canadian, but hey, are in two different languages, French and English. Of course, Canada's two official languages are English and French, and both films are actually shot in Canada. In the case of Lawrence Anyways, the film is produced by Charles Gilbert and Nathaniel Carmitz of France, as well as the French-Canadian Lise Lafontaine of Quebec. The film is directed by Quebec's own Xavier Dolan and stars both the French actor Melville Popad and French-Canadian Suzanne Clément. With Take This Waltz, the film was produced by Susan Cavan and Sarah Polley, and directed by Sarah Polley as well, starring American Michelle Williams, Canadian Seth Rogen, Canadian-American Luke Kirby, and American Sarah Silverman. Now, the film isn't considered to be only Canadian. However, it is also considered to be a co-production with Spain and Japan, thanks to its distributors in Spain's Alta Classics and Japan's Broad Media Studios, as a complement to the main distributor of the film, Canada's Mongrel Media. So now, what happens when a film starring a massive Hollywood A-list actor teams up with a Canadian director from Quebec, and the producer's production money and origin of the film's distributors stem from France, Spain, and Canada? However, the film is entirely shot in Canada. This is where things get a little difficult to immediately identify as far as a film's nationality. In the case of Denis Villeneuve's Enemy, the film is considered to be part of Canadian cinema with good reason. However, as mentioned before, two other countries have companies that funded the project. Say Enemy was shot instead in the US, but with a Canadian director, Canadian, French, and Spanish production support, and say American producers involved as well. What would then happen? Perhaps in this case, Enemy wouldn't have been considered a Canadian film, even if it was funded by Canadian producers and in the hands of a Canadian director, because the identification of a film's origin actually seems to rest on some type of spectrum, where the most important aspect comes from the producer and the film's production company's origin, but secondly, where the film was actually shot and made. So with this understanding of what makes a film Canadian rather than of any other origin, despite there being cross-cultural business being made and lots of different producer money involved, it should make things straightforward then, right? Well, not so much, because some films that aren't directly funded by a country or any producer from said country can still end up, in a sense, adopted by the country it is filmed in, simply because of a cultural impact or embrace of the shooting location or film setting and the culture that the movie is shot in, as far as real-life location and fictional location. Take, for example, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. The film basically screams Canadian, with a ton of references to Canadian culture, a strong embrace of the country's quirks and nuances, and the city of Toronto explicitly attached and highlighted in the film's script. And the film also stars Michael Cera, a well-known Canadian. However, the film is directed by Edgar Wright, British director, and the production money comes from the United Kingdom, the United States, and also Japan. So this is where national cinema, being defined by the film's cash flow origin, could become something that could be potentially doubted or ignored when it comes to a country's citizens identifying Canadian cinema, and perhaps their personal connection to the concept of it. This is where another critical issue in Canadian cinema comes up, in a debate that could go on for days, and that is the issue around the difficulty the country faces as far as essentially having become what some refer to it as a maquila film industry. This meaning a place where big money Hollywood productions can save a hefty sum by filming in Canada, employing some local crew members, but at the end of the production, once it's released to the rest of the world, it becomes known as an American artistic export, and no credit is given to Canada, because perhaps there was no Canadian money invested in the project. Why is this a problem? Well, because English Canada shares so many similarities to the United States, making it very difficult for English Canadian film to stand out and differentiate from the massive Hollywood machine that is simply impossible to compete with, without doing so by subverting audience expectations and trying to do something completely different and perhaps alternative or experimental in response to the American domination of cinema and the entertainment industry at large. However, the incredibly exciting example of War Witch or Rebelle gives Canadian filmmakers and Canadian cinema a new opportunity to embrace our society's role in the world as a multicultural and diverse landscape, completely made up of immigrants and people from all over the world who have come to the country to work and live in. The fact that Canada is so connected to the rest of the world and its immigrant population means that perhaps Canadian film's angle is to really create an impact by telling stories of the cultures and people from nations that have created a bridge between Canada and itself, through immigration, for example. However, in the case of Kim Nguyen, who is also from Quebec, he is creating unique cinema that has distanced itself from Hollywood in huge ways, but this hasn't been seen as commonly in English Canada in recent years, with few exceptions coming from directors such as David Cronenberg and Guy Maddin. So it doesn't take far to see how Quebec has done a phenomenal job at cultivating a distinct cultural cinema and film industry, where French Canadians will support Quebecois films and pay to watch them in theaters, which is a huge benefit for Quebec filmmakers who don't have to worry about having to compete hopelessly with Hollywood. But instead, they've created their own cinema, and these films both make a profit and get watched around the world. This might signal to English Canada that some new angle must be taken in order to have any hopes of achieving similar success, but the other option is to keep the status quo intact. But when has the spirit of filmmaking ever been about preserving the status quo? Thank you so much for listening. I've enjoyed exploring Canadian cinema with you all. My name is Dane. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Sky's the limit.